talking about are representation critiques, otherwise known as Rep's case. So, critiques of representation discuss and state that some way that the AF talks about issues is bad. It generally applies to how an AF is portraying something and why that portrayal is bad. These are not plan focused. This means that it's not a question of the specific action and whether or not that's good or bad, but rather how is the AF action being used, how is the AF action being discussed throughout the evidence and throughout the rhetoric that the AF is using. So for an example, before we get into more specific examples, the AF can say that McDonald's is the only American culture. Representation K would be saying that representing American culture as only McDonald's ignores the various cultures created by immigrants. In this situation, the neg is saying that the representations of the AF statement are bad and something that should be rejected. It's taking issue with the portrayal of American culture and how the AF is saying that McDonald's is the only form of that. So a more specific example that's actually used in debate is a security K. So a security K is a common example of a reps K, and it's important to note that these can definitively be embedded within other Ks, i.e. it means that other Ks can make claims of securitization to bolster their own argument. In this situation, it's arguing that the AF creates a threat that does not exist in order to justify government power. Thus, the government is able, whatever the AF action is just a form of government interventionism that doesn't actually need to happen, but rather only happens because there's some threat, but that threat is only a constructed and isn't actually in existence. A good example of this is the Patriot Act after 9/11. 9/11 was viewed as an attack on the homeland, and thus we needed some kind of security defense to robustly prevent against it, despite the fact that they knew about the attackers from 9/11, and it was a question of people not realizing it, and additionally finding out people's individual conversations through technology wouldn't actually do that much in terms of helping and finding threats to national security. Another example of a reps K is the Orientalism K. This is really popular on foreign policy topics, and it's basically a question of how do we represent the West and the America and European countries versus how do we represent the East. The East is in reference to not only the Middle East, but also countries and actors like China, who are viewed as irrational. So the AF portrays these Eastern actors as irrational to justify Western expansionism. So, for example, people who are alt-right hacks will say that China created COVID-19 in order to justify putting economic sanctions on China. This is an example of Orientalism. Although there is no proof that China did create COVID-19, they use this and say that as a result they are irrational, not to be trusted, dangerous, in order to justify letting the West dominate the global economy by cutting off China from the rest of the world. This is obviously bad because China did not hold culpability for COVID-19, and saying that they did is Orientalist because it moves the blame from the lack of global health infrastructure towards specifically China, but not for the purpose of actually helping health improve, but rather just helping Western countries promote their expansionist policies. So now comes the question of how should we answer reps Ks. So first thing is that you should be able to justify your representations. When you're reading the AF and you're reading that the oftentimes supercharged language that's used within a lot of documents, you should know the context of what they're talking about. Every part of the 1AC is pre-researched, and it's important that you know what the benefit of saying certain things is. If you say, China is too dangerous to have nuclear weapons, you need to give empirical proof for why that is the case. Otherwise, it becomes an Orientalist trope, and you need to be able to justify your representations as either logical or good in some sort of way. This can include saying that these representations are good. It can also include saying that you are not part of those representations. There's a difference between the literature that a lot of security or representation authors will talk about and the actual evidence from the 1AC. The 1AC may talk about how lethal autonomous weaponry is necessarily bad for China to have because it causes escalatory scenarios, but that's very different than pinning everything on China and saying that China is the worst state actor to exist. The second is a form of Orientalism and is irrationally portraying China as some monster or giant that's going to try to take over the West, whereas the former is just a well-researched policy option that is based with an empirical proof of like Chinese expansionism, i.e. the Belt Road Initiative. You should be able to explain that there's a difference between what they are saying and what the AF is. This is essentially a form of a no-link argument that can be coupled with a perm as like saying that these representations are bad, but simply talking about these other countries is not what these representations mean. Yeah, so the AF is a policy, and historical discussions of past rhetoric are outdated. This is also really important because a lot of their evidence will be talking about how in the past policy was used to be justified. So in the past, how like the Vietnam War was justified because it was like they can't democratically elect their own leader, so we need to go in and intervene for them. But rather, that's not what the current policy that the AF is proposing is. Just because it happened in the past doesn't mean that it's happening in the future, nor does it mean that the AF is a form of this. So, in conclusion, Reps Ks indict the AF portrayal of events. This is separate from other types of Ks that we will get into in later courses.